Thank you, and welcome to American Principles and Actions Forum on Immigration Reform. My name is Terry Schilling, and I'm the Executive Director of American Principles in Action. Before I begin, I'd just like to thank Hillsdale College for allowing us to use this room and their facilities to host this event today. Today, we will unveil an immigration reform plan that is built on conservative principles. We hope to have an open, constructive, and honest discussion about what quality immigration reform looks like. When I look at the state of the national debate regarding immigration reform, I can't help but think that we've gotten off track. To many outside observers of the immigration debate, it seems that the goals of the left are purely political and disregard certain political realities, both in actually getting a type of common sense plan that can pass through a divided Congress and in actually fixing and addressing many of the problems that our broken and outdated immigration system has. And just the same to outside observers, it seems that the goals of the right are purely political, but in a different sense, in a sense of more appeasing the base. To many, including the Hispanic community, the Republican Party has become the party of no when it comes to immigration reform. As conservatives, we have a job to do, and that job is to offer solutions, but not just any solutions. We have to offer solutions that are based on the same principles that this country was founded on. Solutions that promote and affirm our human dignity, the belief that we have rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that these rights come from our Creator, and that no man can take them away. Human dignity should be at the heart of our immigration debate. Not just the dignity of immigrants, but the dignity of U.S. citizens as well. This is our goal at American Principles in Action, to return human dignity back to the heart of public policy. And that's what our goal is here today with immigration reform. And now I would actually like to welcome the Associate Vice President and Dean of Educational Programs, Dr. Matthew Spalding of Hillsdale College, to give some welcoming remarks. Dr. Spalding?
Good morning. I'm Matthew Spalding with Hillsdale College. Welcome to the Alan P. Kirby Center for Constitutionalism and Citizenship here in Washington, D.C. I wanted to just briefly welcome you here. You might wonder why Hillsdale College is in Washington, D.C. Hillsdale College, you might know, is a college in Hillsdale, Michigan, founded in 1844, an old school. It's here in Washington, D.C. because we see this as an extension of our teaching mission. It was founded in 1844 by Free Will Baptists who wanted to form certain types of individuals who knew the liberal arts, but also would perpetuate civil and religious liberty, and would form the types of statesmen and thinkers about our politics necessary for the good of the country. From the college's beginning, it was involved in our nation's politics. It was an abolitionist college, was actively involved in the Civil War, sending many of our young men to fight for the Union. And ever since then, we have seen our purpose to engage and contribute to that public discussion. The question of immigration is one of the questions in our country that we face that demands and needs the type of statesmanship we have seen throughout our history, which is to say a compromise, a principled compromise. Not compromise in the way the word is oftentimes used in our politics today, which means a squishy a negotiation, but a compromise in the sense of, say, a Henry Clay or a Lincoln or a Washington or a Madison that advances our principles in a way that moves towards those principles but takes into account practical reality. Those are the kinds of conversations we teach, we talk about, and we like our facility to be used to advance for the good of our country. So with that, I would just like to welcome you here to Hillsdale College's facility in Washington, D.C. I commend the conversation, my good friend Alfonso, and the work of today and the work he's doing on immigration. And I hope you have a great afternoon and day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spalding. And now I would like to introduce the executive of American Principles and Actions Latino Partnership and former chief of U.S. Citizenship in the Bush White House, Alfonso Aguilar.
Good morning to everyone. I also want to welcome you to our Immigration Forum, and I want to thank Hillsdale College and the Assistant Dean of the Kirby Center, my good friend Matt Spalding, for hosting us this morning in this fantastic venue. And I think it's ideal that we're holding this conversation at Hillsdale College. We decided to convene this forum because we believe that the debate over immigration has lasted way too long. And it's time for Congress to finally do something to begin fixing our dysfunctional immigration system. The issue simply cannot be avoided. It would be highly irresponsible to postpone dealing with the issue out of political considerations, especially if we take into account the serious effects that our disjointed immigration policies have on the security of our national territory, on our economy, and on the overall well-being of our citizens and communities. We have a southern border that is not fully secured. There are, in fact, parts of it that are totally lawless, a circumstance that human and drug traffickers take advantage of and that terrorist elements can potentially exploit. Meanwhile, we have around 11 million people living in our midst without legal status, living in the margins of society, which is certainly not healthy for the social cohesion and stability of our cities and communities. While they're doing jobs that Americans may not want, often they unfairly compete against American workers because unscrupulous employers can pay them below prevailing wage or minimum wage. Make no mistake about it, this is a grave crisis. And there's absolutely no excuse for members of Congress to sit on their hands and do nothing. It's time for Congress to show leadership. I understand that Congress is frustrated with the president. President Obama has used this issue exclusively for political gain as a wedge issue to get support of Hispanic voters. Let's not forget, he promised over and over that he would deal with immigration reform the first year of his administration. And we know what happened. He didn't lift a finger to push the issue forward, even though he had a Democratic House and Senate. Since then, he has only given speeches about immigration, mostly grandstanding, and not doing anything authentic to reach out to Republicans in Congress to get legislation enacted. Sadly, it's all been a farce. And back in November, despite his lack of leadership on this issue, he had the nerve to say that he was tired of waiting for Republicans to act. And he went ahead and issued a series of executive orders to postpone the deportation of around 5 million undocumented immigrants. If he's really interested in passing immigration reform, why didn't he give the new Congress an opportunity to weigh in on this matter, to have an open and healthy debate? Could it be perhaps that he wanted to poison the well to ensure that nothing happened in this Congress? Could it be that the president and his political associates don't want to see Republicans take credit for getting immigration reform done? Could it be they just want an issue, not a bill? Some say that this argument is too cynical, but those that know Washington and the bitter political confrontation of the Obama years know full well that this is a very plausible reason for the president's unilateral action. Yet Republicans should not fall for this political trap. While I would agree that the president cannot be trusted, this is not a reason for not tackling this tough issue. To the contrary, it's an ideal opportunity to show Republicans have better ideas to solve our immigration problems, and that Republican Congress can actually get done what Democrats have only talked about. Moreover, there are ways for this Congress to pass immigration legislation that begins to put our immigration system in order and don't depend on whether the president can be trusted. It's important to note as well that for the past 10 years, conservatives have been bullied by a small but loud anti-immigrant restrictionist lobby into a simplistic choice on immigration. We either support Obama's amnesty or we support Chris Kobach's self-deportation. This is a false choice. There is a third way, a conservative way to approach immigration that is based on the rule of law, but also on the realization that immigration is good for the country and for our economy, and that the market is better equipped than the government to regulate migration flows into the country. With this in mind, I'd like to propose a 5-step action plan. For this Congress, that offers uniquely conservative ideas to solve our immigration problems, as well as a path forward for congressional action. What I'm proposing is not radically new. Some of the ideas have been suggested and talked about for many years now. In fact, Congress is starting to take action on some of them. What we have done, however, is to outline them in a clear piecemeal framework that is, in principle and process, consistent with conservative principles. The challenge conservative policymakers face is how to guarantee the security of our national territory, while at the same time we welcome the foreign workers our country needs to grow the economy and create good-paying jobs for working Americans. Clearly, there are no easy answers, and you should be suspect of anyone who tells you they have the perfect plan. The plan we announced today is not perfect, but is very reasonable, and it would undoubtedly go far in fixing the structural deficiencies of our immigration system. As I've stated, our plan is based on 5 steps. And to address each step, we propose that this Congress, in this session, pass individual pieces of legislation sequentially. First, we must begin by securing the border. We call for extending double fencing to all areas along the southern border where illegal crossings can potentially occur to maintain effective and realistic operation control of the border. While border security has improved, our southern border remains far from secure. In 2014, apprehensions along our border with Mexico totaled almost 480,000, with over 330,000 of those taking place in the Texas section of the border. The reality is the Rio Grande Valley sector in Texas is practically lawless and not in control of the Border Patrol, regardless of what the president says. Border fencing, specifically double-layered fencing, along with the manpower and technological assets needed, work to stop or deter illegal entry. Nonetheless, since the Secure Fence Act of 2006, less than 50 miles of double-layered fencing has been built. Double-layered fencing should be built along the 700 miles where the law mandates fencing and extended to other areas not contemplated by the law where illegal entry is possible. This would drastically reduce the number of illegal entries, which would translate into a substantial reduction in the number of apprehensions along the border. Now, operational control of the border should not be unrealistically defined as the capacity to detain 100% of those who try to enter illegally. This is impossible to accomplish. A more realistic target is 90%, which is still, I think you would agree, a very high standard. Second, we must enforce immigration law at the workplace. Congress should mandate that all businesses use the Federal Employment Eligibility Verification System, or E-Verify, to ensure only citizens and individuals with legal status are employed. Happy to report that the House has begun work, the House Judiciary Committee, on E-Verify. Most immigrants who come to the U.S. illegally do so for work. If we can ensure they cannot find a job if they lack legal status, we will remove the main incentive for entering the country illegally. The document-based protocol that most U.S. businesses currently follow to check the employment eligibility of a worker, however, is very ineffective. Applicants are merely required to attest that they're eligible to work and submit copies of documents and information like Social Security numbers, green cards, and state-issued driver's licenses. Employers only archive those documents, having no way to prove their authenticity. As a result, fraudulent documents and information such as fake Social Security numbers and green cards are regularly used to game the system. E-Verify, on the contrary, provides much-needed reliability and accuracy. It is a government-run, internet-based system that verifies the authenticity of the documents submitted against records from the Department of Homeland Security and the Social Security Administration to confirm the employment eligibility of the applicant. It is free and quick, usually providing results in seconds. Third, we must fully implement a biometric entry-exit tracking system of foreign nationals to ensure they depart the country by the time their visa expired. This is not known generally, but 40% of undocumented immigrants do not enter the country illegally, but come legally and overstay their visa. However, it's very difficult for Immigration and Customs Enforcement to go after these individuals to detain and remove them, since it does not have a way of knowing who has returned before his visa has expired or has overstayed. While we currently take down biometric data for foreign nationals at points of entry, we do not have an exit registry to record when they leave the country. A biometric exit tracking system would perform this function, identifying for ICE most visa overstays. Now, border security and domestic enforcement should be a priority. But we must also deal with the other challenges that we face, specifically what to do with the 11 million undocumented immigrants living here and how to facilitate the legal flow of foreign workers our economy needs. This Congress should definitely pass legislation in this session now to address these problems. But since I realize we cannot trust the administration, I propose that we pass the legislation but postpone the implementation of these specific measures to after the president leaves office in January 2017. We pass these bills now for these two specific challenges, but we implement them later. Therefore, as a fourth step, we propose that after steps 1, 2, and 3 are executed, and not earlier than January 21st, 2017, we implement a market-oriented guest worker program that allows businesses that cannot find American workers to recruit and bring into the country temporarily as many unskilled agriculture and non-agriculture foreign workers as they may need. 2, we substantially increase the quota of H-1B visas for foreign professionals with advanced degrees in science, technology, engineering, and math, the STEM fields, as well as the number of green cards available to STEM students. 3rd, we allow foreign STEM students who are offered employment here to remain in the country while they adjust their legal status. We should remember that a guest worker program was absent in the immigration reform law of the Reagan years. That's the central reason it failed. The more than 3 million undocumented immigrants legalized at the time had already been absorbed by the labor market. Yet, American employers still needed more foreign workers. And without any more work visas available, they kept coming in illegally. Our economy needs a steady stream of foreign workers to perform jobs Americans don't want to do, or for which there are simply not enough Americans of working age. Even during these difficult times, there are many industries that could not continue to exist in their present prosperity without foreign labor, at the low skill and at the high skill levels. Agriculture and technology are certainly a few of them. Now, let's face it. Most Americans are not lining up for hard, physically draining jobs in agriculture or food processing plants, nor they want to do cleaning jobs in the restaurant and hospitality industry. Most feel that they are overeducated for this type of work. Moreover, it's not easy for employers to find American-born workers under 50 to do many labor-intensive jobs. It is evident that our native-born population is aging, and we don't have enough people to fully replenish our unskilled workforce. At present, there are not enough work visas for foreign workers to come in legally. Moreover, work visa programs in existence are overregulated and burdensome on employers. Congress has arbitrarily set quotas that don't reflect the needs of the market. The yearly limit for unskilled non-agricultural workers, for instance, is merely 66,000. This is why immigrants end up entering illegally or overstaying their visas. There are no efficient legal ways for migrant workers to enter the country. There is no line. People say, go back in line. Well, there's no line to come here to work legally. In other words, government intervention and regulation has created the problem of illegality. We have a system where government and not the real labor demands of our economy determine how many foreign workers are allowed to come each year. The population of undocumented immigrants currently in the U.S. is only a symptom of the immigration problem. We can improve border security and toughen domestic enforcement of immigration law, but if we don't have a way to manage the future flow of immigrants, we will continue to see people coming here illegally to work. And that's the power of the market forces of an economy like ours. A temporary worker program would incorporate into our system the concept of circular migration. Foreign workers who come in legally, perform their work, return to their home countries when they want to, and then re-enter legally to get back to work. Contrary to popular belief, most immigrants who come here don't want to settle in the U.S. and become citizens. If they end up staying, it's because to return home would require them to go through the unpleasant and dangerous experience of trying to enter the U.S. illegally all over again, which of course they don't want to do. A workable guest worker program is not only important for businesses who cannot find American workers, it is also essential to avoid separating migrant workers for extended periods of time from their families in their home countries. Too many children remain father and motherless in Mexico and countries of Central America because we impede the circular movement of migrant workers. Democrats love to talk about family reunification, but only to justify allowing more people to come in the country to stay permanently here with the political expedient hope that they will become citizens and vote Democratic. Let's keep families together, but where they belong and where they want to be in their home country. In the specific case of the tech industry, we're just not graduating enough Americans with advanced degrees. We therefore need to ensure that we have a steady supply of professionals from abroad so companies in this field can continue to innovate and grow. A large percentage of the students that do graduate with advanced degrees from U.S. colleges and universities are foreign. Yet most leave because our system makes it extremely difficult for them to find a visa to stay here to work. It's time to put an end to the myth that immigration is bad for the middle class, that immigrants are taking jobs from Americans or depressing their wages. This is restrictionist propaganda that is simply not based in fact, but on economic analysis that is nearsighted and static, that sees healthy population growth as an obstacle to economic growth, based on the quite radical idea that more people in a country means less opportunities for its population. History, in fact, proves differently. During the years of the baby boom, when our workforce grew dramatically, wages skyrocketed. It is when the growth of our labor force began to slow in the early 80s as a result of a substantial reduction in our birth rates that wages began to go down even after we began receiving hundreds of thousands of immigrants from Latin America. Ironically, immigration probably ensured that wages didn't go further down for Americans. Foreign workers actually help increase wages for Americans and create good-paying jobs for them. In a dynamic economy like ours, immigration generates increased economic activity. They expand the consumer base, immigrants expand the consumer base, and by filling niche jobs that Americans don't want, they help create jobs upstream in the labor market. Immigrants therefore complement U.S. workers. Without enough workers doing cleaning jobs in a restaurant, for example, you cannot create good-paying waiter and management jobs for Americans. Similarly, with more construction workers, we can increase the demand for U.S. engineers and architects and bring up their wages. President Reagan understood the positive impact of immigration better than many. Already back in the 70s and 80s, labor groups and restrictionist organizations complained about immigrants who come here to work. To them, Reagan simply replied, and I quote, "It makes one wonder about the illegal alien fuss. Are great numbers of our unemployed really victims of the illegal alien invasion, or are those illegal tourists actually doing work our own people won't do? One thing is certain in this hungry world: no regulation or law should be allowed if it results in crops rotting in the fields for lack of harvesters." End of quote. The fifth and final step is to provide a path to legal status to undocumented immigrants. Again, after steps 1, 2, and 3 are executed, and not before President Obama has left office in January 2017, the government should provide legal status to undocumented immigrants, including individuals who entered as minors or so-called dreamers. After they pay a fine and back taxes, they will be allowed to remain and live in the U.S., but they would not have a special path to citizenship. Undocumented immigrants with significant criminal records, including serious felonies and repeated misdemeanors, will not have access to legal status and will be removed from the country. We cannot deport 100 million undocumented immigrants, 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country, nor should we want that. The immense majority of undocumented immigrants are good, hardworking people that contribute to our economy and our communities. Many have been living in the shadows for decades. They did, however, break the law to come in or stay in the country. They should therefore not be rewarded with a special path to citizenship. That would be unfair to the hundreds of thousands waiting in line to come here legally, wishing to reside in the U.S. permanently and become citizens. This does not mean that we would close the door to citizenship to them, but we would require them, if they want to naturalize, to get in the back of the line and follow the process under current law to acquire lawful permanent residency and become a citizen. Recently Hillary Clinton tried to distance herself, saying that she was for a path to citizenship and that Republicans were against that. And that's a fallacy, and we have to set the record straight. What Republicans are against, generally, is a special path to citizenship. We're not foreclosing the door to citizenship. By all means, if you want to become a citizen, become a citizen. But don't get in front of the line, the cutting line. And I think we're willing to have that debate, and we should encourage our candidates to take on Hillary Clinton and have this debate, because she's not being truthful with the American people and the immigrant community. What the majority of undocumented immigrants want more than anything is to become legal, not to become citizens. Under the immigration reform of the 80s, of the approximately 3 million people that were legalized, only 40% decided to naturalize. However, it's time for Republicans to lead, for conservatives to lead. This Congress has a unique opportunity to show that Republicans can tackle the toughest issues of our time, like immigration, and propose unique solutions that are practical and common sense, and yet consistent with the principles of our founding enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. I believe the 5-step action plan that I have just outlined provides a path forward for this Congress, one based on conservative principles. And I can assure you that many Democrats, perhaps most Democrats, including President Obama, will not like the basic tenets of this plan, precisely because they respond to conservative ideas. And that's okay. If President Obama wants to veto a bill based on these ideas, he will have to explain to immigrant and the Latino community and to all Americans why he opposed a Republican plan that secures the border, strengthens our economy, and brings undocumented immigrants out of the shadows. Conservatives, however, should stop listening to today's nativist naysayers, who apparently don't believe in America's exceptional ability to welcome and assimilate people from every corner of the world. The question Republicans and conservatives need to ask themselves is whether we, out of fear, are going to go back in time and adopt the protectionist responses to past economic difficulties. The policies championed by the Republican Party of Herbert Hoover that led to trade barriers and tight labor markets. Or are we going to embrace Ronald Reagan's belief in America as an open and free economy that thrives thanks to the contributions of immigrants? Are we going to be the party of Reagan, or are we going to be the party of Hoover? I think we should embrace President Reagan's optimistic vision of America as the shining city on the hill, which he described in his farewell address to the nation, and I quote, as a tall, proud city built on rocks, stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors. And the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. End of quote. We look forward to working with members of Congress in the House and Senate in the next weeks and months to promote a conservative piecemeal approach to immigration reform and ensure that this Congress enacts a series of bills that fix, once and for all, our dysfunctional immigration system. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alfonso. And now it is time to have a conversation, have a discussion. And with us today, we've been very lucky to have some of the most dynamic people from across the country with very different backgrounds, but all of them bring forth a different perspective. So now I'd like to introduce Ms. Lila Rose, the president of Live Action, Mr. Niger Innes, the executive director of TeaParty.net, and Alex Narasta from the immigration policy analyst at the Cato Institute. Thank you guys for joining us today. We really appreciate it. My first question goes to Lila. Lila, as a pro-life leader and activist, do you view immigration reform as being important? And if so, why?
Well, I think that it's absolutely important. I think there's obviously a perspective being offered here, and I'm not here to advocate any particular plan, but I think the discussion is very important because immigrants coming in, first of all, immigrants in the United States who are here legally and immigrants here who are undocumented are hugely targeted by the abortion industry. 1 out of every 6 abortions today is done on an immigrant, undocumented or a citizen or a resident here. And I think that there needs to be a lot of evaluation of why this is happening. The abortion industry makes obviously money off of this, and then you deal with sex trafficked victims who come over the border, and that's also very problematic because they're brought here. The abortion industry, of course, is a partner to sex traffickers because abortion is a tool to further enslave sexually trafficked victims. And there are statistics that say there are up to 18,000 women brought over the border, work people not just for sex trafficking, but for slave labor. So that needs to be a consideration in all these discussions about the importance of looking at what's happening with trafficking on the border and looking at what's happening with the status of immigrants in our country.
Yeah, I know that's very insightful, and I agree with that. Now, my next question is actually for Niger. There's been a lot of talk recently, and since 2010, since the Tea Party rose up, and there's almost this consensus, or I don't know, consensus that conservatives and members of the Tea Party are anti-immigration. Do you think it's possible to build a serious coalition of conservatives to support immigration reform, or, in your opinion, is the Tea Party dead set against any type of immigration reform?
Well, it's go on with the stereotype. It's that the Tea Party not only is against immigration reform, but hates immigrants, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And we're all a bunch of white racists, which is kind of hard for me, considering I'm the executive director of the TeaParty.net. No, it's a mythology. In fact, first of all, let me thank you, Terry, and Alfonso and Matt for facilitating this discussion today. I think it is very, very important, and it's not important just for the immigrant community or the Latino community. It's important for America. It's important for Americans. I think we not only have to deal with a broken immigration system, we have to deal with a broken immigration debate. And it's because of this broken immigration debate, and let me just briefly describe what I mean by that. And Alfonso eloquently talked a little bit about this earlier. You have one side, usually the progressives, that use immigration as a political weapon. I recall during the Gang of Eight debate that a former congressman, Stephen Horsford out of Nevada, actually made the statement that comprehensive immigration reform, when I think of these immigrants, I think of Rosa Parks. You know, and you had Senator Schumer during the debate actually threatening that if the bill that he was pushing through the Senate did not get passed by Congress, by the House, that there were going to be civil rights style protests in the streets over the summer. And see, when you have a debate, I mean, that's one, and of course you've got some demagogues on the other side too. When you have that type of discussion, you can't get to real positive affirmative solutions like the ones that have been proposed today. That's why a couple of years ago, I formulated, I'm executive director of the TeaParty.net, but before I was executive director, I was the senior political advisor. And in that capacity, I formulated a set of immigration reform principles to avoid that kind of raucous debate and discussion that polarized the American people. And there are a variety of principles, and they're available on the website. I can make available. But we form these principles in consultation with folk like Governor Bush and Senator Marco Rubio, but also Senator Jeff Sessions, who not only reviewed our principles and endorsed them, but actually added a provision to the principles. And when we released these principles, contrary to the popular belief of all these racist white Tea Partiers, we had over 100,000 Tea Party leaders across the country sign on to these principles. Now, that's before President Obama went into executive order overdrive, of course. But the fact is, within the Tea Party, we embrace immigration as long as the rule of law is respected, as long as the immigrants that are coming to the country are being assimilated, and as long as immigrants that are coming to the country are adding to dynamic economic growth and not adding to the growth of the social welfare state. And I think as we move forward with the principles that have been laid out today and with legislation in Congress, we need to think about that. Well, let me just end my opening remarks, though, with one last point, which is I actually think that the real crisis that is facing our country is not so much immigration or illegal immigration or even the border, but I think it's the question of assimilation. And this is a crisis not just in the United States of America, but throughout Western cultures around the world, be it Western Europe, Australia, Japan. You have a demographic crisis in Western Europe where the population of Europeans is going down dramatically, and they have to bring in workers to support their growing social welfare state, and they're not assimilating those new workers that could add to the economy and the cultures of these societies. In fact, more than not assimilating them, they are allowing balkanized, isolated, and angry entities within these countries to exist and to grow, which of course become fertile soil for the radical jihadists, ISIS and the like. So I think that is going to be a fundamental issue that has to be integrated into the discussion around immigration. To take off my Tea Party hat for a second and put on my Congress of Racial Equality hat, I'm the national spokesman for the Congress of Racial Equality, a 73-year-old civil rights organization, and we have what we call a comprehensive assimilation program in Nevada that operates in Nevada. A couple of thousand people have come through that, mostly Latino, but not exclusively. And we teach English, we teach about the Constitution, inspired by Hillsdale College. We teach about the Bill of Rights. We teach about the responsibilities that come with citizenship. And most importantly, we teach that citizenship is not, contrary to what the left likes to promote, that it's some type of civil rights entitlement, that it is a privilege, and that if you are fortunate enough to become an American citizen, you have the responsibility to give back. And contrary to, again, the left, you do not get pushback from in my class. You don't get anybody, any Latino saying, well, I'm sick of learning about these dead old white men. Teach me about Pancho Villa. Quite the contrary. You get people that appreciate what we're doing, who thank us, and after they graduate and go on to become citizens, actually come back to teach the next generation of kids. I'm hoping that we can inspire a great awakening among conservatives to have institutions like this through the churches and other community organizations all across this country. Because I tell you right now, and I'm going to shut up in a second, tell you right now, the left has hundreds of organizations doing that type of work right now, okay? And we are losing the battle for our country today. And I don't care, we can put up a Berlin-style wall on the border and deport all 11 million undocumented today, and we're still losing the war. Because that war is being fought in our schools, at our universities, in Hollywood, and in these assimilation centers that the left is controlling.
Thank you. Now, Alex, Niger just brought up two points I'd like to address. He brought up the idea that our immigration debate is broken. And I think that part of this is due to this 24-hour news cycle that we've got going on where you just have tons of rhetoric being spewed out every which way. Recently in the press, I believe it was about 2 weeks ago, Governor Scott Walker actually came out and said that immigration could be bad for the middle class, that it depresses wages and it hurts our economy. One, is that true? And two, is that a conservative argument?
So no, I don't think it's true. I spend a lot of my time reading these really boring, lengthy, complex academic papers that try to get at this issue. Do immigrants depress wages? And the simple answer is that they don't, especially for the middle class. Most immigrants are either less skilled than Americans or more skilled. It would be odd if they competed for jobs in the middle where most Americans are. It would be odd if a low-skilled worker from Mexico who doesn't speak English very well, who works in a low-skilled construction job or in agriculture, were to decrease the wage of an American accountant. That'd be kind of odd, wouldn't it, if all labor was equal in the market? So no, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Generally, because there's not much competition between most immigrants and most Americans, because they have different skills, they're what economists call complementary. That is, they work together in the market. And one of the better examples of this is a restaurant. They're complementary by language. What jobs do lower skilled workers work in a restaurant who don't speak English very well? Typically, they're busboys, they're janitors, they're jobs that don't require communication with the customers. Now, what jobs do the low-skilled Americans do? They do jobs that are like the waiter, the waitress, the hostess, jobs that require communication with the customers. Now, which jobs are more highly compensated? The jobs with communications, the jobs that require that. So you have the effect of pushing Americans up. So you might have some occupations where the wages go down, but Americans are not static. They move into different occupations as a result of immigration, and as a result, their wages go up. Another result is entrepreneurship, which increases the demand for labor in the economy. Immigrants are almost twice as likely to start a business in any given year as a native-born American is, which is remarkable given the American propensity for entrepreneurship. That's a really remarkable statistic that you find. So to create some jobs that way, or at the very minimum employ that entrepreneur. And the other one, which is obvious, which almost no one brings up, is that immigrants are people, so they buy things. When they buy things, that increases the demand for goods and services in the economy, which means that there is more job creation elsewhere. Now, every single argument you hear against immigration, taking jobs from Americans or lowering wages, is an argument against people as well. Just replace the word immigrant with people or college graduate or high school graduate or something like that, and see if the statement makes any sense. And you can tell automatically almost none of them make any sense because it's an absurd comparison. It's really a misanthropic argument. It's an argument that people are somehow bad for the economy, which gets me to my second point, which is for a long time, conservatives, free marketeers, libertarians have argued about the virtue of having more people. Julian Simon, who's one of my favorite economists, argued against environmentalists for decades, who said this environmentalists said this increasing population, they're going to use up scarce resources, we're all going to be poorer in the future as a result of this, yada, yada, yada. You've all heard the same nonsense. He said, no, everywhere and always an increasing population is correlated with increasing standards of living. It's because people are not just mouths to feed. We don't just consume things, we make things. We have brains that come up with new ideas, and it's not new ideas like the iPhone, okay? That's a 1 in a billion type person who comes up with stuff like that. It's new ideas like, for instance, making a business run just a little bit better on the margin here. You know, you can use 4 or 5 less tools to put together your car over here. Small changes all around this. And people are really the drivers. They are the foundation. It's obvious, but they're the foundation of economic growth and advancement. So no, I think it's too bad that a so-called free marketeer like Scott Walker, whose policies I really admire when it comes to Wisconsin. Standing up to labor unions is really dramatic. It's done great things for Wisconsin. I just wish, and he used to be, by the way, pro-immigration reform. Now, his statement was a little mealy-mouthed when he talked about immigration. You know, he said that he was, worried about these effects and that he had talked to Senator Jeff Sessions, which indicates to me where he's changed his position. But he said he's in favor of an immigration policy that favors the middle class. If that's true, he should favor one that liberalizes immigration. Because these workers are different from the middle class, which means they're complementary, which means they're going to be good. They're going to buy the products produced by Americans in the middle class. So I think it's too bad that he at least indicated that he has become open to sort of these nativist ideas that more people is somehow bad for the U.S. economy.
Interesting. It seems like there's this belief that's still resonating from the 1920s or so that people can be pollution. And I think that anytime that you start walking down that road, it needs to be soundly rejected.
And if I could add one thing to that, I'm a trained economist, and one of the embarrassing things is if you read back during the Progressive era, Francis Walker, who was one of the first presidents of the American Economic Association, laid out exactly that argument. Equating these new immigrants who are from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe, they said, they're unassimilable. There's no way they can ever become Americans. They're defective in numerous different ways, and we need a government policy to step in to really solve this problem, because he said it was like an externality. It was like pollution, like we needed to change this stuff. And I'm happy to say the economics profession has moved on from that radically in the face of evidence, in the face of new theories, to now support almost overwhelmingly immigration to the United States. But these arguments have an enormous amount of traction over time, and I think it's more of an indication of the failure of my profession to try to teach people about the facts.
It's not just your profession, and Lila certainly knows this. Right during that era, Planned Parenthood was founded.
Yep.
And Planned Parenthood was founded specifically to deal with those immigrants, not to mention my people too, and other blacks and browns and whites from the bad parts of Europe, like Southern and Eastern Europe. Planned Parenthood was created to minimize the high birth rates in these communities. So it wasn't just the economists, it's a bunch of progressives that had that philosophy.
So let's get back to that. Lila, earlier when you first opened up, you made a connection between the sex trafficking industry and the abortion industry. And I can't help, my mind goes right to this next point, which is, do you think that our broken immigration system increases sex trafficking? I mean, we have a lack of border security. We have a lack of an exit and entry registry system. It seems like the system that we have right now in place, the broken, outdated system, is leading to more sex trafficking and allowing for more of it. And I almost wonder if that makes a connection with a broken immigration system to abortion.
So a few things there. I think that, first of all, how the system is broken, why it's broken, how to fix it. Obviously, there's a lot of different opinions about that. But I think everyone agrees that we have a problem. And the problem, it would be wrong of us to ignore the fact that we're dealing with an incredible full frontal assault of the abortion industry against Hispanics, blacks, but particularly Hispanics, where about 35% here in the United States are undocumented, and they're accounting for, comparing to the white community, they're having the abortion rate is twice as high. And you have targeted ads in Miami and Los Angeles and all over the country on the Spanish channel, in Spanish newspapers, particularly Spanish-speaking targeted, discounted abortions, trying to solicit more customers to the abortion industry. So there's that aspect that has to be taken into consideration, because we're dealing with human lives here. And they're on our soil, and if they're conceived in the United States, they're our people. We need to care about them. So there's that. And you mentioned sex trafficking. I think that's, of course, also very important to consider. Many people the information is starting to emerge more that we have a crisis in our country, not just with the human rights of the child, protecting them from the viciousness of the abortion industry, but with sex trafficking. And many of them are domestic victims, but many also are brought in, are trafficked in from other countries, and are literally sold. Sometimes they're being told of a better life in America. This happened more predominantly decades ago, but it still happens today. And when you have that problem, what ends up happening is, first of all, you have undocumented women here and young girls who are being trafficked and sold for sex. And that's because smugglers are literally bringing them over. So we need to address that. I mean, I don't know that there's any positive policy that we've all agreed on, but it needs to happen. And then number two, once they're here, again, the link to the abortion industry, I head up the organization Live Action, and we investigate the abortion industry extensively in many different ways. And one of the aspects that we've investigated and documented is their connection with sex traffickers in this country. Because there's a don't ask, don't tell policy on sexual abuse in the abortion industry. So whether it's a young girl who's just the victim of sexual abuse or incest in her family or with a relative, or it's an actual sex ring of underage girls, and you're a pimp and you want to cause an abortion or somehow get access to reproductive health services, you're going to try to find a center that's going to ask no questions. And you also ideally would find a center where you could get a discount or even get taxpayers to fund it. And I mention that because Planned Parenthood is actually advocating for free abortions for undocumented immigrants here. And I mean, they obviously have it all lined up. And by free, that means taxpayers pay for it. So someone pays to kill the child of a woman who's feeling very desperate and alone, and sometimes women who are brought here because they're being sold for sex, or a young girl. So this is a very human side of the discussion. It needs to be evaluated. I don't hear it enough on either sides. It needs to be talked about. I know that there's different perspectives on the solution, but if we don't see the entire harm, not just the economic aspect, although if you want to discuss the economic aspect, killing off our children isn't good for the economy through abortion. The over 1 million abortions a year isn't good for the economy. That's another discussion that can be had. But it's not just an economic aspect with immigration, but it's the human aspect, talking about children and talking about victims of trafficking.
Thank you, Lila. And that's the main reason that we brought you on the stage, is because of your reverence for human life and to bring that perspective. To more talk about the political perspective, Niger, there's this idea that in order to become president of the United States, in order to win the nomination for the Republican Party, to win Iowa, you've got to be anti-immigration. Do you think that, you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but do you think that the conservative base is anti-immigrant? Do you think that the conservative base in Iowa is anti-immigrant? What would you say to that?
No. There's a pretty famous congressman out in Iowa that makes unfortunate statements from time to time, and he's a friend on immigration, but I think that would give the wrong projection. Again, I would go use what we did as a model to how to appeal to conservatives. I mean, again, when I look at immigration and I look at immigrants, and I think if we have the right policy and the right leadership, of course, in Congress and in the White House, then this generation of immigrants can be very much like past generations of immigrants, which is they could feed the economy, they could feed economic growth, but at the same time, we have to have a commitment and a discipline to really make sure that, as opposed to what the progressives want, which is for them to feed the dependency state, to feed the abortion mills, make sure that our policies gear immigrants towards feeding the dynamic economic growth that we've had in the country, historically speaking. And I think if conservatives talk about that, if conservatives talk about assimilation, the importance of learning English, the importance of learning about our Declaration of Independence, our Bill of Rights, our Constitution, American history, and by the way, not just for immigrants, but how about for Americans that have been here for generations that don't know these things? I think if we get into a discussion on citizenship and a revitalization of civics and citizenship, then I think conservatives are going to be on solid ground. And I think be it within the Tea Party or be it the Republican caucus in Iowa, that you're going to have broad support. I mean, obviously, there are going to be different points of view on the question of immigration, and certainly I suspect no one within Iowa is going to want immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform that President Obama signs because of his mischief. But in terms of really tackling the questions of immigration and citizenship and assimilation, I feel very comfortable and confident as a conservative that we can promote those things.
One of the things I noticed about your plan, or the principles that you released that were accepted by the 100,000 Tea Party leaders, is that there were a lot of different ideas in there. And I don't remember there being a principle about kicking all 11 million immigrants out of the country.
Absolutely not.
Which brings me to my next question to Alex. There's certain leaders, radio show hosts and flamboyant columnists, who basically argue that anything short of booting out these 11 million undocumented immigrants is amnesty. Do you agree with that, or is that I don't know? Just speak to that a little bit.
Anything short of that amnesty, no, I don't think that. I mean, given the amount of hoops that, if there ever is a legalization that goes through, the number and severity of hoops that these folks will have to jump through, is going to be pretty big, and it's going to be, and they're going to be so onerous that they might have to even be a second legalization after that, because so few will actually fit through all of the all of the issues. But what I want to say is, if laws aren't working right now, and we spend tens of billions of dollars a year trying to enforce our immigration laws, we conscript every employer in the country to be an arm of immigration enforcement by forcing them to fill out a silly I-9 form. States force E-Verify on employers to force them to be at the front of immigration reform, and it's not working very well. I would argue that in that situation, the proper thing to do is not to keep doubling down on enforcement every once in a while, but to change the laws to what works. If we were taking a look at something like prohibition and the failure of prohibition, I think they tried for a while to enforce the laws, but they didn't work. The smart thing to do is to change those laws. Now, some people might think, oh, well, alcohol was totally illegal, while some immigration is illegal, so it's not a good analogy. Well, you could get alcohol back then through your doctor, through a prescription. There was a very vast black market of that at the time. But another good example is taxes. Between 25 and 40% of Americans commit tax fraud every year in their income tax forms. Every year. Do you think that we should catch every single tax fraudster before we cut taxes? Of course not. It's a very selective application of a very flawed view of the rule of law, that we need to enforce these international labor market regulations perfectly before we can actually change these laws going forward. And I would argue, the three principles of the rule of law are equal application, adherence to our principles, and the third one's escaping me at the moment, but it's equal application, adherence to these principles, and you can ex ante predict what's going to happen. So under all of those, the immigration laws fail dramatically as they are right now. They're not applied equally. There are per capita quotas that are absurd and arbitrary. You don't ex ante know what the outcome is going to be if you enter that system. You talk to any immigration attorney who talks about this, they will tell you the exact same thing. You got two immigrants from the same country, came in the same year, applying for the same visa, same characteristics. One is denied, the other is not. Totally arbitrary. And it's absolutely contrary to our values as a free society. Absolutely contrary to the traditions in the common law, contrary to some of the first immigration laws passed in this country, contrary to the common law traditions that we get from the United Kingdom and our Anglo-Saxon peculiar legal traditions. So on every single one of those principles, it fails. The rule of law does not mean that we enforce every single law on the books 100% of the time, always. That's not what it means. It means that we have good laws consistent with these principles that we do as well as we can at enforcing. And I think that that's something that we often forget. It's really easy to have a bumper sticker that says rule of law. Try putting those three principles on a bumper sticker. It's going to be very hard to explain.
Alex, I want to go back to you real quick on something. There was a report released 2 years ago. And one of the points that this report made, it's an anti-immigration reform report. And they basically argued that we shouldn't pass immigration reform until we fix our welfare system. They argued that because we have a broken welfare system, it will lead to manipulations and fraud and create a whole new welfare state that would just be unsustainable. What would you say to someone that argues that point?
So there are a couple things that I would say. One, low-skill, poor immigrants are much less likely to use means-tested welfare than poor Americans. You want to make sure you do an apples-to-apples comparison. Most welfare programs are designed for people who are relatively not well off, but are poor. So we want to compare poor immigrants to poor Americans. In this thing, we find that they are typically use far less welfare programs than the typical American. So much so that if poor Americans used Medicaid at the same rate as poor immigrants, the program would be 42% smaller, which is quite a dramatic decrease. So that's one of the things that they sort of ignored in this report. But one of the big points of this report was that it would cause deficits in the future. That it would increase deficits by having more immigrants come to the United States, or by legalizing the immigrants that are here. And the main failing of this report was that it assumed that there would be no economic consequences of immigration reform, that the economy would essentially be static, and as a result of that, there would not be any kind of economic growth, which goes contrary to the entire academic economics literature on this topic. So unfortunately, they made some false assumptions. They did what I think they violated the first commandment of conservative or free market policy analysis, which is thou shalt not produce a static paper. Thou shalt assume a dynamic economy. And I think they violated that principle off the bat, and of course they got a negative result. And that's to compare to everybody, all the other academic papers which do a dynamic analysis and find very different results. Now, some of these papers find, in the long run, a very small net fiscal cost due to immigration. Some find in the long run a very net small fiscal benefit to immigration. But you take a look at all these studies, and they basically average out to around zero. If you're going to make a case for or against immigration reform, the budget case, like the idea that it'll boost deficits or decrease them, is probably the weakest case that both sides can make on that issue. It's just not much of a difference either way. Many other things make a difference. Now, to give you another example about this report, why it was silly, it did a 50-year projection. It came out in 2013. Now, what if we did a 50-year projection in 1963? How absurd would that have been up to 2013? The Great Society programs hadn't happened yet. Do you think that projection would be worth anything? No, it wouldn't be worth anything. That's why people don't generally do those types of projections. We can talk for another hour or two if you want about the numerous detailed failures in this report, but I think you get the point.
Let me
go ahead
on that as well. Alex may very well be right on the failings of the report, but I think as conservatives, we need to be deadly serious about making sure that whatever type of immigration piecemeal legislation that goes through Congress and is eventually signed, that again, it becomes a lever to reduce the welfare state, the social welfare state, and not increase it. And again, I don't want to sound like a modern Joe McCarthy, saying there's a communist under every carpet, but I'm telling you that there are hundreds of progressive organizations embedded in these immigrant communities all across the country, and some of them, just to give you an anecdotal example, a friend of mine, Chinese American, that is embedded in the Asian American community in Nevada, said to me that some of these organizations in Nevada are actually teaching Asian Americans, traditionally, stereotypically, the least, the ones you would think of least that would be on social welfare, how to game the system and how to get on welfare and how to get some of these dependency benefits. There's no question that the progressives, either inadvertently or philosophically, very purposefully, would like the population of new immigrants that come into the country to become feeders to the social welfare state.
I think one thing to add there too is that, you mentioned these hundreds of progressive groups. I don't like calling them progressive because that term should be a positive one.
Fair enough.
But you have among those groups, it has to be mentioned, Planned Parenthood.
Of course.
And groups like Planned Parenthood. And this is not a small thing. Planned Parenthood is a $1 billion a year organization. And you go to their Twitter feed and they've tweeted about and they've activated about the DREAM Act. And so they're involved in this fight. They have a dog in the fight. What is their dog in the fight? Their dog is that they like to have taxpayers fund their operations, and the more clients that they can get a tax write-off per thing that they do, whether it's assisting the stream of sale that ultimately ends with a woman having an abortion or whatever it is, they want to get more people in their abortion facilities. So when you're looking at the messaging around this, again, there's a lot of different perspectives here. I'm not here to advocate for one particular plan or another, but you have to look at the arguments that are being used and why are people, and address their motivations. And I think the abortion industry is talking about this. They're joining themselves to other groups and claiming that they care about immigrants, but what they really care about is abortion and pushing their ideology, which is also rooted in an ideology of eugenics, this idea that some people shouldn't procreate, some people aren't good enough, and that we need to be exposing that. I think that needs to be a part of the discussion, and you say you are not allowed a seat at the table because your interests here are human rights violations and against the dignity not only of the child but of the woman.
That's right.
And I want to add one more point. Cato, as far as I know, is the only organization in town that wrote a detailed report about how to build a wall around the welfare state, how to actually deny non-citizens, systematically looking at every single one of these big programs, how to change the laws, what to do, and what to change them to do it. I oppose the welfare state for everybody at all times, foreign-born American citizens. But I find so I want to use immigration as an argument against welfare. A lot of my conservative friends, unfortunately, want to use the welfare state as an argument against immigration. So I think they have entirely backwards. And I want to say, if you take a look at American history, The parts at the times when the welfare state has exploded in its size and and in these new programs are after immigration has been closed off. Paul Krugman, not a person I like to cite freely, wrote a great column about 6 months ago where he said, listen, he said some positive things about immigration reform back in the day, today, but he said, but back in the day it was necessary to close the border because otherwise you could not have had the New Deal. One of the better arguments waged against the New Deal was immigrants are going to take advantage of it. And he said it was absolutely essential to get the New Deal created that you had to close off the border to immigration prior to that. In the 1960s, when the Great Society programs were created, it is no coincidence that that was the lowest point in American history for immigration in terms of the foreign-born population. It dipped at about 4.5%. It was not lower prior to that, and it has never been that low since then. And it is no coincidence, and Paul Krugman made the same argument about that, these big welfare expansions, big increases in the size of the welfare state happened when the foreign-born population is decreased. To give you one more example, the per capita real expenditures by the federal government grew 17-fold between 1930 and 1970, when immigration in this country was very difficult to virtually impossible. That is the program that a lot of my friends at the Center for Immigration Studies, Federation for American Immigration Enforcement Reform, and Numbers USA want to go back to this policy. During that time period, per capita expenditures of the federal government grew 17-fold. Since 1970, the federal government has certainly grown, and I think we all can be sad about that, but it's doubled over the same time period. 17-fold increase per capita, doubling. Prior to 1930, when immigration was closed off, you had about a doubling over the last 40 years up until then. So all the correlations are backwards. We seem to have the greatest growth in the size of the federal government and in the terms of their power when immigration is most restricted to the United States. And I'd like to see a lot of them seriously address that argument rather than just using sort of a bumper sticker slogan that, immigrants all vote Democrat and we're all going to live in a socialist paradise because of immigration. Like all the historical data goes against that.
Let me dovetail on that too, actually, just to say that, just anecdotally speaking, if you have a situation where an immigrant cannot get certain social welfare benefits, such as Obamacare, and this is probably going to get me in big trouble, but and you have an employer that has an opportunity, a small business employer that has an opportunity that's living by the margins, to hire a particular individual that they would be required to provide Obamacare to, an individual that they would not be required to give Obamacare to, who are they going to hire? And would that not be a good thing, quite frankly, in terms of reversing and swinging the pendulum back towards liberty and away from a growing social welfare state? I know that's going to get me in big trouble. But I think it's a good thing. I mean, if you step outside of, once you give social benefits to human beings, it is very difficult to take them away. So if we're going to move the pendulum back in the other direction, I think immigration is going to be a part of that solution, not part of the problem.
No, and I agree with that. And I think part of Alex brought up something that was I thought was very insightful, was that Hispanics and immigrants are much more likely, are the fastest growing group of business owners and entrepreneurs. And Alex, could you speak more to that effect? I know that there's studies out there that show that it's actually small businesses that create jobs, and that actually big businesses tend to cut back because they're more efficient. So what would you say to someone that actually says that immigrants are a drain on job creation?
So I'd say every big business begins as a small business. So you got to start somewhere. And a lot of these folks do have small businesses. What we see, the Public Policy Institute of California did a good study about a decade ago about immigrant entrepreneurship. And what they found was a lot of these poor immigrants decide to start businesses even if their income is lower than what they could make at another job, because they value a lot of that for whatever reason. And one of the survey results was they value the independence, they value the ability to set their own job hours, they value the ability to make their own decisions and not be bossed around. Now that sounds pretty darn American to me. And it sounds like it really has a huge upside potential in terms of what some of these businesses can do and do grow going forward. So at the very minimum, a lot of these businesses employ the person who starts them, creating, decreasing sort of competition for other jobs in the market. And when they do very, very well, they employ numerous other people in the jobs market. What we've seen, the Kauffman Foundation has done a lot of work on this. There has been a decrease in entrepreneurship across the board in the United States. And I think we can blame a lot of that on changing demographics in the sense that the country is getting older. And a lot of people who are older tend not to take risks like starting a business. It's kind of foolish to put your 401k on the line if you're 60 to start a new business. You're just less likely to do that. Some people do, and congratulations, you're a very brave soul, but it's not typical. So having a few, increase in the number of younger people who are here is good for that. Another reason why it's declined is just the whole plethora of regulations in terms of Obamacare, in terms of other regulations, in terms of taxes. Some of these regulations put on the books for the purposes of immigration enforcement that they have to deal with. But immigration can and does increase the demand for labor in the U.S. economy. And by the way, one of the things that they buy and they have to buy are services provided by people. They buy hamburgers, they go to the grocery store, they buy haircuts, they buy things like this. Services that are usually supplied by lower skilled Americans in the labor market. So if they only bought iPads from overseas or only bought iPhones, things that the profits are owned by wealthy Americans, skilled Americans produce them, and foreigners and factories get the benefits, then the economic benefits would be smaller. But the fact that they increase sort of the labor demand for a lot of these people who are Americans who are in the lower rung of the labor market is good evidence. And I want to say, a lot of people have pointed out, wage declines or, wage stagnation in the United States since the 1970s and 1980s. We see the same results in countries that don't accept many immigrants at all. We see it in Korea, we see it in Japan. We see it in countries that accept more immigrants than the U.S. as a percentage of the population. We see it in Canada, and we see it in Australia. Now, it tells me that if it happens everywhere, regardless of the level of immigration, something other than immigration is causing it. And economists have a lot of fancy terms and theories for this, but it's not immigration that's causing wage stagnation for some members of the labor market.
Well, that gets to my next point. You mentioned our aging population in America. And Lila, this is something I'd like to talk to you about. There's this, we mentioned before that there's this belief that, too many people is bad. And part of the anti-immigration case is that they argue that we shouldn't allow more people in. Do you agree that there can be too many people, or, what would your general thoughts be on that?
Well, I think, first of all, from a human rights perspective, once you're a people, once you're a person, you have rights. So once you're conceived, once you exist, nothing can take that away. Nothing should be able to take that away from you. So even if you think it might be better or worse for the economy, better or worse for any other number of human reasons, once you're alive and you have human rights, they cannot be you cannot violate them. So that's just I think the first principle. It's a thorny question when you're tying it to immigration. Thorny, first of all, because one of the reasons we have a struggle, I think, economically, and actually there's been different studies that have been done on this, but when you're killing off your children, and Europe is in a demographic decline. They call it the demographic winter because the replacement rate is 2.1. And they're not having enough children. They're under the replacement rate, so many of those countries are declining. And there's actually incentives in many European countries to have more children in order to stop that economic and ultimately cultural decline. It's a dead end. And the United States, there's patterns that indicate that we may be headed that way. What is the solution to that? I would say the first solution to that is stop killing our children. You can have a discussion about immigration. I think that's important to have. I know that's what we're here to discuss. But the idea that less people equals a better future, of course, I think is flawed. There's, from an economic perspective, which I think others can speak to more than myself, it's flawed. People do not equal a lack of wealth or consumption of resources, but they can help create them. And also from a perspective of human dignity. A life is not something that you can toss around on an economic chessboard and say it's not worth it, so let's destroy it. And I think when you're talking about human life and the right to life of children, it's most winsome. When you're talking about the question of how we treat our immigration system, I think it needs to be considered. But I think there are good voices on either side of the debate that do value human dignity, but they have a different approach to how to achieve the strongest America. So I think that's a question that, of course, is being discussed.
Part of the reason the population decline has not taken place in the United States the way it has in Western Europe and Japan is because of immigrants. It's because of our immigration policy and what immigrants do when they get here in comparison to native-born Americans, which is have children.
Now, Niger, we've discussed the crisis that our broken immigration system has caused. I mean, it's causing problems with our economy, it's causing problems with human trafficking, but still there are those that are advising Republican leaders in Congress right now, since they control both houses, to avoid the immigration issue, to not address it, to wait until we have a Republican president, because they don't trust Obama, which is partly...
Perfectly understandable.
Right. I tend to side with them a little bit on that one. Do you agree with that? I mean, or do you think that there's a way? Do you think that the American Principles and Actions plan is a good starting point?
Yes.
Do you think that would be something that would be sellable in this type of Congress?
I think that we need to change the battlefield on the debate of immigration. And in order to do that, we need to embrace our own set of values and principles regarding immigration. And again, it's not just immigration, it's citizenship. It's citizenship, it's assimilation. Just an example, a little quick example of how we could do this, change the terms of the debate. Look at the DREAM Act and Dreamers. And, look, I, in theory, am generally in favor of the Dreamers and the Dreamers not being deported. Innocent kids that came here not of their own volition. But where we kind of lost the battle there is we said, well, Dreamers that either serve in the military or go on to university, they should get a break from the American people. And you kind of lose the battle there. A little quick anecdote and joke. A friend of mine said to me, my goodness, you have one group of Dreamers going to defend the country, another group of Dreamers going to learn how to hate the country. It's a joke. But there are elements of truth in that joke. What if we as conservatives said, we want to have two levels of Dreamers? Dreamer 1, those who have or are willing to serve in the military, and Dreamer 2, which are those who have the fortune to go on to college, and give certain advantages to Dreamer 1 category and say, maybe you're not only on a pathway to legal status, but you're on a pathway to citizenship, whereas Dreamer 2 is not necessarily on a pathway to citizenship. Well, my goodness, the heads would turn around on the left, okay? They would go bananas over any kind of proposal like that. Oh, good. Let's have a debate on that. Let's say that the Dreamer that is willing to give his limb, potentially his or her life for his country, is more deserving of a pathway to citizenship than the Dreamer that has the opportunity to go to college. And I'm not suggesting that we deport that kid either, but I am suggesting that we as conservatives have got to be aggressive about coming up with our own set of ideas and changing the terms of the debate.
I want to make a quick note about assimilation that I think should be included. A lot of immigrants, particularly immigrants from Central and South America, bring with them very strong values. I think that's been talked about before, and I think it's important to note. So when we're talking about the importance of assimilation, I think we need to be very blunt about recognizing our own problems as a country and recognizing the fact that we have the most liberal abortion laws up there with North Korea and China in the world. So you have immigrants coming from other countries that, and I'm not saying Americans don't have strong family values, but I'm saying that a lot of the countries that they're coming from have stronger abortion restrictions, and abortion isn't so commonplace, accepted, tax funded as it is here. So as we're fighting to maybe strengthen and review how we approach the assimilation process, we can't leave out that very important fact, and the fact that immigrants who come here are having 1 out of every 6 abortions.
I just want to make one quick note about universities and schools. Niger touched on this. The bad thing is that, the curriculum in these schools, the things that they teach these kids, usually bad. The good thing, though, is that our kids aren't learning anything in schools. So I just want to put that out there as sort of the more optimistic and rosy side of it.
Insurance policy.
That's the one good thing about government education in this country. People don't learn much.
Thanks, Common Core. We've got time, I think, for one more question. Then we might be able to open up for audience, to the audience for questions, depending on how long it takes. But Alex, there are arguments against expanding the guest worker program. And they say that if we expand the guest worker program, we are going to flood the market with foreign labor, crowding out American-born workers. Your response?
Well, one of my responses is, well, compared to what? Compared to the current situation where you have 11 to 12 million unauthorized immigrants, around 8 to 9 million of them in the labor market working illegally. In such a situation, you can't regulate that. Now, I hate to say this as a libertarian and free marketeer, but you can't regulate a black market. So if you actually want to have more restrictions on this, if you want to make it so that you have a more controlled migration system, you actually want to legalize this and make it possible for a flow to come in the future. And what we see historically is that immigrants come to work in the labor market in specific niches. They don't come here. Very few foreigners want to come here and compete in the middle of the labor market. They don't necessarily have the skills to do so. They're on one end or the other. You have a lot of masters and PhD people, a lot of high-skilled people. You have a lot of lower-skilled people on the other hand. They compete at sort of the wings and the niches of these markets. They compete where there's opportunity for this. Even when the U.S. had open borders, and with the steamship, by the way, so it's pretty easy to come here and cheap, you had years during economic declines or when certain industries were dying where nobody on net, 0 people came on net. You had as many people leaving as were coming here. So if we want to create sort of a market-based immigration system, which I think we do want, we want the number of people who come here and work in the economy to be determined by the economy, to be determined by the laws of supply and demand and not some central planner in Washington, D.C., we need to open it up as much as possible. Now, I would argue the market does a better job than a government bureaucrat trying to copy what the market wants at any given time. But having a more market demand, more market-based system is better. Now, also focusing on the fact that most of these workers who come here or who would come here on guest worker visas are complementary to Americans, most of them. Now, some of the times you're going to have competition. That's an inescapable part of the economy. There are undoubtedly going to be a handful of Americans who are going to face stiffer job market competition. We can't lie about that. We shouldn't lie about that. We should take into account the findings of the literature that find that there are some folks that sometimes who do face that. But is the correct response to that to block off and highly regulate even more international labor markets? Is the answer more regulation, more government controls, more fees, more bureaucrats, more power to lawyers, putting more of this power in the hands of those folks? Or as free marketeers, as libertarians, as conservatives, do we think that perhaps the market will produce a better outcome than what has been produced over our decades of highly managed migration? The situation we have now with illegal immigration, people drawn here to massive wage gains due to immigration coming here, is outside the legal system, is a result of our bad laws. It's a result of the government trying to control too much outside of its ability to do so. I think we recognize that for other spheres of the economy. We recognize that for healthcare. We recognize that for energy policy. We recognize that when it comes to regulating firearm ownership. It's about time that we recognize that when it comes to immigration and labor issues, too.
Thanks, Alex. We have time for one question.
John. Give it to John.
Glenn Reynolds, most of you know. Glenn Reynolds, I think he's basically considered a libertarian blogger, had a very interesting column a couple weeks back. He was discussing the wage-fixing scandal in Silicon Valley. This is the conspiracy of Eric Schmidt, head of Google, the late Steve Jobs sort of instigated this too, of Apple, Intel. These various tech companies got together and agreed a no poaching agreement. Essentially, what they were doing was wage fixing, fixing the wages of American workers. So these companies are not great defenders of the free market. That's just an aside. So they're involved in wage fixing. So Glenn Reynolds, who's essentially a libertarian, said, well, why don't the conservatives and the Republicans actually stand up for the American middle class and attack it and attack the tech companies, attack the Silicon Valley oligarchs, who are actually, of course, Democrats anyway. I mean, Eric Schmidt, if you remember, ran Obama's personally ran Obama's get out the vote electronic operation on election day. I mean, that's where Eric Schmidt was. The entire Silicon Valley oligarchs, they're all left Democrats. We see what their position is on life issues. We see what their position is on same-sex marriage and any kind of social issue. They're with us on nothing. So Glenn Reynolds said, well, why not do what Walker is doing? Support the American middle class. This would be one way of doing it. And come out against the tech oligarchs and say, you're actually with the Democrats and the liberals. That's your group, and we're with the American middle class. What do you guys think of that?
Alex?
I think it's a terrible idea. I think a lot of these people in Silicon Valley are left Democrats. A lot of them are not. Peter Thiel comes to mind as one example of the only one in Silicon Valley. You're saying, John? Well, there's a lot of libertarians and free marketeers in Silicon Valley who support this. They may not be, the people that you can pinpoint as the top head of a lot of these companies, but they're a lot more intellectually varied. And I would. Excuse me. Do you mind if I finish my question, John?
Okay, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Cartels. He wanted to talk about wage fixing in cartels. The one thing we know about labor cartels is they're hardly ever viable and hardly ever to sustain themselves for any period of time. And I would say that our immigration laws make it more possible for these wage cartels to exist because you have H-1B regulations put in place that prevent a lot of these workers, foreign-born workers, for instance, from being able to change jobs. That's one way that you can get around it, is to make these workers more mobile. Another thing is that we know historically wage cartels just fail. They don't work very well. Sometimes if a worker wants to sign a non-compete agreement when they begin a job and move to other places, that's an accepted part of business in a lot of different places, and I think it would probably be better for the economy if those contracts didn't exist. But if you have people at a handful of companies who agree not to raise wages, what's going to happen? Other companies that are smaller that are coming up are going to raise their wages a little bit to compensate from that to get the talent that goes there. You have a very mobile labor market in the United States. People do move between cities a lot in favor of these opportunities. So it's just not a sustainable system despite the best impact, the best intentions. Furthermore, as Adam Smith pointed out, you hardly ever, there is no such thing as like a very libertarian or free market company. Companies are out there to make profits, period. Entrepreneurs are out there to make profits, period. One of the things that scares me about increasing statism is that it produces another way for entrepreneurs and companies to make profit, not by making a product that people want necessarily, but by bending to the will of the government and the regulator and the state. That's one of the reasons why I oppose a lot of statism and regulation. As Adam Smith said, you rarely have any businessmen get together or any traders get together without it ending in a conspiracy against the public. The fortunate thing, and that was back in the 1700s, so the fortunate thing is that there's always other companies and other competitors that break down these cartels in the market. That's why they don't function very well.
Can I ask John,
Just one second. Alex, that's a political question I was asking. Whose side do conservatives want to be on? On the side of the tech oligarchs or the side of the American middle class?
So I don't think turning the GOP into the American version of the Labor Party is going to conserve any conservative principles, which is exactly what it do. Furthermore, the idea that having fewer workers in the United States or being opposed to corporations on the tie end is a progressive argument. We're beating down people who are successful for political purposes. For what reason? Because we don't like that some of them vote Democratic? Now, I'm kind of a partisan person sometimes, but that goes a little bit too far. I mean, who here thinks that if we copy the policies of the British Labour Party in the labor market and want these regulations and restrictions, that any component of conservatism will survive? It's not going to survive.
Let me ask you, John.
Nigel, go ahead.
Let me ask you something, actually, in that. Are you saying that these tech monopolies, that they wage fix and then they use H-1B visas to deal with that wage fixing? Because if there were not more H-1B visas, then the American population would go to that small business competitor.
In the case of Southern California Edison, they did. In the case of Disney, and also Microsoft, Google, they were actually firing people at the same time. They were doing
I think
different jobs, of course, too. Different jobs.
I'm not talking about regulation. I agree with Alex. We don't want any more regulation. I'm talking rhetorical.
we need to take it very seriously, rhetorically. Yes.
Why are we playing kid gloves with it?
I don't think we should copy the rhetoric of 1930s progressives in the Democratic Party when it comes to this. I don't think using terms like economic royalists or oligarchs, people who made their businesses royal. When I think oligarch, I think of a Russian former bureaucrat who was handed a $1 billion company by the Russian state corrupt. I don't think that that rhetoric works here in the United States. And personally, I'm turned off by it, and a lot of people are turned off by that.
Actually, I got to cut it off now. Otherwise, people won't be able to get coffee between our next speakers. Can we just give these guys a round of applause? I mean, they traveled here, and their responses were great. Thank you guys, Lila, Niger, Alex. Thank you so much. We're just going to take a 10-minute break. Be back here at 11. We're going to have Senator Ron Johnson and Congressman Raul Labrador here for a brief discussion. There's coffee in the hallway. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.